al-Athar al-Islamiyyah has always been pleased to invite lecturers to its cultural season who reflect the most recent or most definitive scholarship in a number of fields. Tonight is one of those events. Tonight's speaker, Ambassador Ross Burns, is an historian and archaeologist by training who, during an extensive diplomatic career, was Australian ambassador to Syria and Lebanon. His book, Damascus, A History, has been described as the first book in English to relate the history of Damascus, tracing its history through its physical development from the city's emergence in around 7000 BC through the succession of Aramean, Persian, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Arab, Mongol, and French rulers up to the end of Turkish control in 1918. It has been praised as the most impressive historical guide to Syria in the English language, far surpassing anything previously published. Compelling and unique, it is a huge work of intricately presented factual information and detailed analysis with wonderful photographs, maps, and other illustrations. Tonight, Ambassador Burns will discuss how Europe rediscovered Damascus. In Damascus, every layer of its history has been built precisely on top of its predecessors for at least 3 millennia, leaving a detailed archaeological record of one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. There are a number of visible remnants from the Roman period, notably the wall that delineates the old city, Straight Street, a formerly colonnaded remnant from the Roman grid plan, extending from the eastern gate, another Roman structure, to the western gate. This street, now known as Midhat Pasha, also is bridged by a Roman arc. However, the old city is still a living city, and archaeological investigation is rare. Only when restoration is being conducted on one of the old houses, usually from the Ottoman period, are objects and bits of architecture from its past uncovered, as was the case with Beit Aqad, the subject of a lecture at the Dar in the past. It is known what archaeological investigations would find. One thing is known, though, and the texts written about Damascus confirm this, that no more mobile phones will be found. And I hope they will not be found here tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please turn them off and let's welcome Ambassador Burns.
This is the story of how Westerners or Europeans developed their picture of that fabled city, Damascus. I am not trying tonight to sketch the history of Damascus, but want to give you a picture of how part of the city's history was pieced together during the centuries when Europe and the countries of the Arab world had little contact or understanding of each other. To trace that picture of Damascus that emerged in the European mind, I am also restricting this presentation to the unravelling of the puzzle the city posed up to the end of the Umayyad Empire, that is to 750 AD, when Damascus ceased to be the capital of the Arab and Islamic world and declined to a more humble status for many centuries. In other words, I am not trying to trace how the Europeans pictured the Damascus of later centuries, the period of the Crusades and the Islamic resurgence which it provoked, nor of the Mamluk or Ottoman centuries and modern times. What I want to do is to trace what preconceptions Europeans brought to their image of the city and how it took over 300 years to throw off prejudices and assumptions and develop more accurate images of its history. While the Europeans were taking centuries to develop a picture of the city, Damascus, of course, was less a mystery to the Arab and Islamic world. It had long been one of the great capitals of Arab civilization, a center of religious and philosophical thought, a bastion against the inroads of the Crusaders, and an important outlet for the produce of the Arab interior and the Muslim East. Western audiences, however, had only one or two bits of information in their minds. Damascus was the scene of the famous Damascus Road conversion of that first figure of missionary Christianity, St. Paul. In Damascus, his preaching first took Christianity out of a purely Jewish context and into the world of the Greek-speaking East. While the city was famed for this single fact, it had attracted little of the intense curiosity in Europe of Jerusalem, 200 kilometers to the south, which from the 3rd century became an important center of pilgrimage for Western Christians. Nevertheless, as early as the 6th century, a Christian pilgrim had identified the supposed site of Saul's Damascus, Damascus Road Revelation, 2 miles from the city. Occasional travellers' accounts of Damascus were, however, largely fragmentary and confined to folklore. While the lines of confrontation during the Crusader period enforced a degree of separation, there was in fact no impermeable barrier. We know, for instance, that even during the Crusades, Christian pilgrims, even knights if they left their weapons behind, could transit Damascus on their way to the famed shrine of Our Lady of Sednaya, a little north of Damascus. There were no pictorial depictions of the city until European publishing saw the introduction of the printing press. The first fruits of this curiosity, however, were ill-informed. This fanciful picture in the middle of Damascus was included in an illustrated edition of Ptolemy's Geography, published in Florence around 1470. It must to some extent have been based on second-hand accounts, since it does manage to get some details correct, such as the city's location in front of a screen of mountains with the 2 branches of the Barada River flowing between the mountains and the walled city seen in the modern photo. The mountains are to the left there and the rivers flow through the built-up city in the middle. Some of the details of the Umayyad Mosque also suggest marginal contact with reality, though the configuration of the building as a whole is wrong. In another example of the overactive mind at work, this plan of the city emerged from a survey of major centres of the Mediterranean world, begun in 1572 by 2 German geographers, Braun and Hogenberg. It appears wonderfully symmetrical, but is even more fanciful than its predecessor of a century earlier. The river, for example, does not flow through the walled urban area, and the central buildings bear no relationship with anything in Damascus. Damascus remained rarely visited by Europeans, and only a handful of early descriptions survive. There was no resident European trading community until well after the Crusades. By the 16th century, the first European trading presence had folded, with merchants finding it easier to base themselves on the coast, at Sidon or later Acre. In any event, the traders' interests were too prosaic to inspire descriptions of the city. By the 17th century, Aleppo was to become the favoured base for European traders and consuls, largely because of the northern city's more prosperous economy. In the 15th century, Damascus hosted a renewed European trading presence, particularly from the Italian states. Venice was the most active, but there were also consuls from Genoa, Florence, and Calabria, in addition to Catalonia and France. This painting, now in the Louvre in Paris, gives us a fascinating glimpse of the city at that time. In fact, the first European attempt to depict Damascus accurately. However, underlining how great was the gap in Europe's knowledge of Damascus, the painting was long assumed to show Cairo, not Damascus, and was so labelled in the Louvre. It was also believed to be the work of one of the Bellini brothers, active in Venice in the late 15th century, and assumed to have originated from a visit to Egypt. The painting had been acquired under Louis XVI in the mid-18th century and still hangs in the main gallery of the Denon wing of the Louvre. But it wasn't until the 1940s, as a result of a fine piece of detective work by the French expert Jean Sauvager, that the setting of the painting was finally recognized as Damascus. Debate has since raged over the date and source of the painting. In the background, in the upper left part of the canvas, is a remarkably accurate view of the southern wall of the Great Mosque, outlined here in red. The insert photo shows the same wall today. The lower parts of the wall were hidden in the painting by intervening structures. The fact that it took centuries for the scene, so accurately recorded, to be identified conveys how little was known of Damascus in Europe until comparatively recent times. The Venetian painting proved to be a one-off. For nearly 3 centuries, little hard information on Damascus was brought back by visitors. Damascus remained a city of fascination, but without facts, to inform speculation about its ancient and Islamic associations. However, in the 18th century, a more informed curiosity emerged. This sketch of the Great Mosque, for example, was made by a Russian traveller, Barsky, in the mid-18th century. It is, on the whole, a remarkably accurate, though admittedly schematic, depiction of the mosque, all the more remarkable in that no Western travellers were allowed into the building before the second half of the 19th century. The areas shaded in yellow are the only worrying touches. The crosses on the main dome and the 2 southern minarets were the first indication that Europeans were intent on finding Christian associations for such a magnificent building. The entirely fanciful form of the northern minaret in the foreground is also difficult to explain. The 18th century Enlightenment in Europe brought more intense curiosity about cities such as Damascus. The English clergyman and traveller Richard Pocock was not the first of the enlightened voyagers to describe the city, but he was the first to apply a more inquisitive mind, registering that there were many remains of the ancient city among the evidence of later centuries. In particular, he concentrated on the remains that clustered outside the Great Mosque, seeking to identify its Roman or Byzantine origins. Pocock even ventured to put down his impressions of the mosque in the form of a plan. The plan shared Barsky's determination to identify Christian associations with the building. As a result, Pocock made a cardinal error, which set speculation on the origins of the mosque on a dead-end course, which was to last almost 2 centuries. Like many travellers until the 20th century, Pocock simply could not bring himself to believe that such a wondrous building could possibly have been the work of Muslims, particularly an Arab empire that had emerged in the 7th century from a supposedly nomadic background in Arabia. He was wrong in assuming that the mosque was essentially the Byzantine church of St. John the Baptist, the building which Arab accounts had reported as preceding the mosque on this spot. In fact, all Byzantine remains had disappeared, and what was adapted from the preceding Roman temple compound was simply the outer enclosure wall, now the wall encircling the mosque courtyard. This is, of course, an instance of what the late Edward Said would have called Orientalism, allowing stereotypes to colour the picture of Arab civilization. Such stereotyping prevented Westerners for almost 2 centuries from gaining a real appreciation of the mosque's great achievement as an early flowering of Arab civilization. Pocock, however, recognised that the original Roman temple had comprised not only the inner enclosure, shaded here in pink, but a second outer enclosure. In this outer zone, shaded green, he added a series of Christian buildings clustering around the mosque, an arrangement of 5 palaces or public buildings, which in his words had been, quote, built by the Emperor Heraclius and dedicated to Zacharias. Interestingly, he's not referring to John the Baptist, but to his father. Quote again, all these great structures were raised under the bishops of Damascus when Christianity was the established religion here. Though Pocock does go on to note Arab accounts that the mosque was, quote, much improved by the Caliph Walid. Pocock clearly knew that this was fanciful speculation. In fact, he disarmingly confesses in a footnote, quote, it may be thought that there is too much conjecture in this plan. He then goes on to beg to be excused for inventing elements to fill in the void in his reconstruction. At least, he says, I make it clear what is the product of my imagination. What is standing is distinguished from the rest, and there was no other drawing else to fill up the plate. In other words, with an honesty that might well be emulated by modern travel writers, he admits that he made it up, since he didn't know how to interpret the area surrounding the inner compound and the stray columns of the outer enclosure. The question of what to make of the outer compound, Pocock had identified, though, the question of what to make of the outer compound Pocock had identified beyond the mosque was to puzzle experts for the next 2 centuries. So I outline the problem briefly here. In order to explain better what Pocock did reliably observe in his outer zone, I have highlighted the columns he marked as solid, in the blue shading, i.e. surviving at the time of the visit. The remaining columns he left unfilled, i.e. the results of his speculation. We will come back later to the fact that the resulting plan highlights the existence of several rows of columns outside the mosque enclosure which do not exist today, 2.5 centuries later. Pocock was wrong in assuming that because the inner compound walls contained many reused classical stones, that the mosque itself must have been converted from the Church of St. John. In fact, the mosque, particularly as seen from its courtyard, as in this picture, the angle of view here is marked on Pocock's map, was purely a project of the early 8th century Umayyads. The great prayer hall, though employing some Byzantine ideas, was a remarkable flowering of Umayyad civilization. There are, though, a number of significant deficiencies in the map which had actually been correctly represented earlier on Baski's sketch. I show Pocock's map here in simplified form, now reversed, with the north at the top. Pocock apparently gained no entry to the mosque, but it's thus surprising that while he gets most of the details of the mosque interior right, including the great basilica-shaped prayer hall, which he called the church, he fails to convey several features that can be discerned from an external inspection of the building, particularly the great transept and dome over the centre of the prayer hall, and the tall outer entrance gateway rearing above the bazaar on the western side. He was, however, aware of these features since they are mentioned in his text. It was to be another century before the Western reader would be provided with further enlightenment. Pocock had laid a false trail that was to confuse scholars for 150 years. The myth had been firmly planted that the great mosque was really the work of the Romans and Byzantines, not the Arabs. In the 19th century, curiosity about Damascus increased markedly. The number of European travellers or residents grew after the Egyptian forces of Ali Pasha took over and held Damascus in the 1830s, unleashing a process of reform which the Ottoman authorities, on their return in 1840, were forced to recognise with the Tanzimat measures, which had the effect of opening the city to outside influence. The next milestone in the uncovering of the city's past was the 2-volume work written by the resident American clergyman Josiah Porter in the 1850s. His new map had the aim of clarifying the city's building record to a Western audience. Porter's plan of the great mosque seen here further documented the perception that had begun to strike most visitors, that much of the city's past, going back to classical times, was still embedded in its contemporary structures. In spite of its small scale, Porter's map of the central area is astonishingly accurate and perceptive. On his original, I've imposed here my own plan based on the cadaster, slightly adjusted to get the same compass bearing, to indicate how accurate Porter was. The writings of other European residents, including Richard and Isabel Burton, furthered Western interest in the city. Richard's tempestuous career brought him to Damascus for a short stint as British consul in the 1860s. During the same decade, the liberalisation process removed the barriers to Westerners entering the Great Mosque, and curiosity about the building's origins took on renewed vigour. Porter detected attributes outside the mosque, highlighting the remains of the outer series of colonnades or courtyards rather more accurately than Pocock had. Porter's plan confirmed that the inner enclosure, or temenos, of the temple, the compound within which the Umayyads built their great mosque, had originally been surrounded by a second enclosure, or peribolos, which was entered by great gates to the east and west. Though Pocock's fanciful palaces fell away, the overall scheme of two concentric rectangles was now beyond doubt. The renewed interest in the city, however, was to lie dormant for several more decades. After 1860, though a small tourism industry developed through the entrepreneurial skills of Messrs. Thomas Cook, the number of visitors remained small until the completion of a railway up from Beirut in 1903. Some of the experts who applied their curiosity to reconstructing the building history of Jerusalem also began to turn their minds towards Damascus. The main motivation was to picture what the Holy Land might have looked like at the time of Christ and during the visit of Paul. It is therefore no surprise that the first scientific visitors were associated with the work of the Palestine Exploration Fund in Jerusalem. The event which energized this rush of new interest, however, was the fire which had almost destroyed the Great Mosque in 1893, reminding the Western world that this city of the New Testament was little understood. The fire began accidentally during work on the repitching of the roof. Fueled by the mosque timber roof structure and by the carpets of the prayer hall, it quickly engulfed the building and its precious decorations. The photos illustrated here show the scale of the loss to the city's heritage. The photo on the left is a postcard of the mosque prayer hall taken for by the Bonfils brothers of Beirut in the 1860s, showing how much of the building's interior was later lost. On the right, the photo taken immediately after the 1893 fire shows the interior almost fully gutted. Most of the interior was reconstructed in new material in a bland and uniform style. Only the external walls and the central transept that the Caliph Walid had built to orient the new mosque in the direction of Mecca survived. Even the transept's great surmounting dome, still surviving in the photo at the top right, was so weakened that it had to be rebuilt in a style more worthy of an Ottoman railway station than the Umayyads' richly decorated interior, glistening once with mosaics, gilded friezes and marble panelling. Concern that this great monument to the whole span of the city's history was at risk brought a rash of scientific studies of the mosque's possible origins and a confused debate as to how much of what survived was part of the Roman temple and the Christian church. In 1894, the British architect Fenner Spears published a series of articles in the scientific and popular press which sought to explain the building's origins. A series of articles by experts funded by the Palestine Exploration Fund then appeared in the fund's quarterly, which still provide an invaluable source of information on the city's origins. '. . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . Before we explore that debate, however, let us go back to fit it into the overall picture that the walled city of Damascus presented. The walls of the city formed a very rough quadrilateral, rounded off at each corner. The city walls are in heavy black lines on this map. The Barada River that made the city possible lies to the north in the upper part of the map. The Great Mosque, constructed by the Umayyad Caliph Walid I between 705 and 715, lies, outlined here in red, in the upper left quarter of the map. Let us now look at some of the remains still surviving today, which had impressed those first interpreters of Damascus's past. You see here the western side of the Umayyad Mosque, with the main entrance for Muslim visitors under the canopy. Many other sections of the ancient walls had been rebuilt to repair damage resulting from earthquakes, fire and invasions over the following centuries. But on this side, the original stonework is intact. This is in fact the external western wall of the courtyard, which had once housed the Roman temple. At each corner of the Roman inner compound stood towers that carried high platforms in the Semitic tradition. The lower parts of the southern tower, the part below the orange line here, were preserved in the mosque built by the Caliph Walid and later used to support minarets. These original minarets, this one in this picture was later replaced by the minaret of Qaitbay, which we saw earlier in the Venetian painting, are some of the earliest in Islam. This shot shows the full run of the south wall of the mosque, the facade also seen in the Venetian painting. The upper part above the orange line is the work of Al-Walid's conversion of the Roman shell to house the prayer hall. This doorway, blocked since the 8th century, had once formed the southern entrance to the Temple of Jupiter and was embellished in the late 2nd century in the ornate style favoured under Septimius Severus. It shows the same extravagant use of decoration as the great temple projects at nearby Baalbek in the Lebanese Bekaa Valley. Looking now to the internal courtyard of the mosque compound, this shot shows how the mosque's prayer hall was fitted within the southern half of the compound, of the courtyard. None of the structures seen in the courtyard are Roman. There are, however, many elements of the classical temple which have been recycled in the Umayyad and later phases of the building's history. On the left, you see the beautiful little mosque treasury, the Beit al-Mal, possibly the work of the Umayyad successors, the Abbasids, and which reuses classical columns and capitals. The columns of the colonnaded arcades, or riwak, that surround the courtyard on 3 sides are also recycled. Balancing the treasury on the eastern side of the courtyard is another beautiful little pavilion recently restored by the Syrian authorities. This dome of the clock, as it was called, was once used to store the mosque's clock collection, but when the Ottoman accretions had been removed, it became obvious that this was an original feature of the mosque, perfectly preserved. Classical and later columns in expensive stone had again been recycled in the construction of the pavilion. We've looked inside the mosque, but let us look now at areas outside for other clues, visible to Western visitors before 1860, on the nature of the ancient and Islamic city. One of the most obvious features, noted earlier, were the remains of the huge gateway that once served as the western entrance to the outer temple enclosure. It still towers majestically over the approach to the mosque from the Souk al-Hamadiyya. Outside the eastern entrance to the mosque lie remains of the huge eastern gateway. It must also have struck the visitor that there was a considerable number of stray Roman elements at many points in the city's fabric. In addition to the odd columns still standing outside the temple enclosure, other elements had been recycled and used in later structures, including the superb doorway constructed by Nuruddin in the 12th century for his Maristan or public hospital, institutions which were common in the Arab and Islamic world long before they were introduced to Europe. Other more mysterious traces of the classical city appeared well beyond the mosque's limit. Here, part of the western wall of the outer temple enclosure, or peribolos, still stands, providing here an interesting backdrop for the current collection of one of the city's dressmakers. The same section of massive wall continues south to form the southwestern corner of the late Roman or Byzantine shopping enclosure, which was clamped onto the western side of the outer temple compound. Now this picture, the bottom right, introduces to our story the work of two remarkable researchers who have given us a picture of Damascus which is in many ways more complete than any published since. This outer complex was first documented by two German researchers during the First World War, both named Karl and with the almost matching surnames Watzinger and Wulzinger. For the sake of simplicity, I'll call them the two Karls. Their photograph of the same sketch, as I mentioned, is on the lower right. Turning the southeastern corner, you still find remains of the gateway to the outer shopping enclosure, which was named after the Greek letter whose form it followed, an inverted L. Some of the stray columns of the outer compound, which had been noted as early as Pocock's map, also survive in places today. Two examples are shown here, indicating the magnificent scale of the original temple enclosure. Another element of the outer enclosure which drew the attention of the Palestine Exploration Fund researchers was the great outer eastern gateway, which provided the main approach to the temple from the east. The surviving remains are shown in the colour photos, with Dickey's reconstruction of it in the line drawing on the left. This eastern sector of the city was studied by one of the Palestine Exploration Fund experts, Hanauer, in a 1911 article which put together the remains of the classical structures along what was clearly a main axis from the east, paralleling the famous Straight Street that lay to the south. The temple was clearly oriented to the east along a grand processional way leading probably from an open forum or agora. By World War I then, considerable scientific findings had been collected which filled out the knowledge of the city's classical and early Islamic scale. The Roman elements depicted in the photos you have just seen are marked on this map of the walled city. The picture of the city's historic centre was thus beginning to make sense in its broad outline to Western audiences. But how was the full expanse of the walled city interpreted? One of the most obvious surviving features was the great gate that stood at the eastern end of Straight Street, the surviving cross-city axis. We know from the New Testament that Straight Street is the via recta of the Roman city, the street called Straight as it was known in the Acts of the Apostles. The gate was clearly the axis's eastern terminus. The upper photo shows the gate before its reconstruction in the mid-20th century. The lower sketch is a full reconstruction which shows in its strict and simple proportions and restrained use of decoration, typical of the Roman early imperial period. The Roman style of the embellishment should not disguise the fact that the idea of a thoroughfare with pedestrian arcades on each side, sheltered from the sun, was very much an Eastern invention, almost unknown in the West. The typical pattern of such thoroughfares, the example in the line drawing on the left is from Bosra in southern Syria, was a central vehicle passage with porticos sheltering the walkways on each side. Behind the walkways stood the stone-built booths occupied by the shopkeepers. The arrangement seen in the photo bottom right from Jerash in Jordan was an ideal way of providing an environment sheltered from the elements and allowing orderly commercial activity. There is no sign in today's crowded Straight Street of this broad 26-metre wide thoroughfare. The thoroughfare shrank over the centuries to a narrow passage for one line of traffic with token pedestrian spaces on each side. However, recent work to improve the drainage and environment of Straight Street have unearthed interesting remains that showed the huge scale of the colonnade that once lined the street from end to end. Midway along Straight Street, a Roman arch has been rescued from its embedded position 3 or more metres below the modern street level. What you see is not the complete arch, but only one of the side passages of what was probably once a great four-sided structure, marking not only a point of deflection in the street, but the crossing of 2 major streets. It is time now to put together the pieces of the puzzle that the ancient and early Islamic city represented. I've repeated on this map of the whole city the 2 east-west axes identified a few slides ago. The difficulty in researching Damascus is that the ancient city clearly lies right underneath the modern. The city's footprint had been firmly planted in the one spot for millennia. In addition, the city centre is still a thriving commercial and residential neighbourhood. Nobody, of course, is interested in having life disrupted by excavations. There was nothing the experts could do but tune their eye to what remained of the ancient city as it emerged in the modern streetscape. If we assemble these assorted elements of the classical city, they give us the above picture of the modern cities, the above picture on the modern city's map. The 2 axes of the city were now clear, the great avenue running from the east to the temple and running right across the city to the south, the street called Straight, marked here as the Decumanus Maximus. The first detailed map of Damascus was a product of the German archaeological survey of the city touched on earlier. The work of the German team, led by the 2 Karls, is a bizarre story. Their assignment originated in Germany's efforts to strengthen Turkey's hold in Syria in World War I. Turkey's German allies encouraged the young Turk regime to commission a series of archaeological studies in Syria-Palestine, which would have the multiple aim of providing basic intelligence of use to the armed forces, discourage the Turks from the practice of mining archaeological monuments for stone for railways, barracks and gun emplacements, and encourage Turkish respect for the Arabs' pride in their heritage. In Syria, the program resonated well with the town planning ambitions of Jamal Pasha, the young Turk Supremo who had been sent to Damascus to oversee the war effort in Arabistan. The eminent German archaeologist Theodor Wiegand supervised the program, but the study of Damascus was put into the hands of the 2 Karls. With admirable devotion to scholarship, their program of researching and mapping all the significant monuments of Damascus and stripping back the town plan to identify the remains of its classical and Islamic era proceeded with extraordinary zeal through all the confusion and privations of 1917. With the end of the First World War, Syria was allocated to France under the division of the Middle East that emerged from the manoeuvrings among Allied nations, the Arabs being very much left on the sidelines. Damascus, as in the Crusades, became a capital of immense symbolic importance. T.E. Lawrence entered the city on the 1st of October 1918. One of the first places Lawrence headed for that day was the tomb of Saladin, just behind the Umayyad Mosque, seen on the map there. He lifted from the wall behind the tomb the gilded bronze wreath, which had been contributed by Kaiser Wilhelm after his visit to Damascus in 1898. The German Kaiser, had been impressed by Saladin's reputation and the sober restraint of the tomb of this great historical figure. Lawrence, however, wanted to emphasize that a new imperial era had rolled around. He put the wreath in his rucksack 2 days later when he left Damascus. In 1920, he gave it to the Imperial War Museum in London, The Kaiser's gesture, perhaps the first European ruler's expression of regret at the damage the Crusades had done to Europe's relations with the Arab and Islamic world, still remains in the possession of the Imperial War Museum. The wreath was recently on display, along with the sarcastic certificate signed by Lawrence saying, quote, "Saladin no longer required it," unquote. France, which regarded its mandate, nominally under the League of Nations, as a great historical mission to restore France's presence in the region, also favoured symbolic gestures of breathtaking insensitivity. The French general who entered Damascus after the Hashemite forces had been defeated in 1920 marched up to the tomb of Saladin and announced over his cenotaph, "Here we are, we're back." This triumphalist motive ran through much of the French archaeological agenda, but it was significantly tempered by sound scholarship and a rising interest in Arab and Islamic civilization in France. French scholars such as Dussault and Sauvaget thus built on the German scholars' work to give a detailed picture of the city's shape. The German studies of the Roman and Arab origins of Damascus were published in Berlin in 1921 and 1924 and are still an invaluable source on the city's history. The two Karls gave further shape to the picture of the Roman city, which they assumed was based on a quadrilateral. It's marked here in the dark grey line, which joined the surviving gates with indentations in both top corners to accommodate the bend of the river Barada. Over the centuries, the Roman walls, of course, have been adjusted, especially with rebuilding after earthquakes and invasions, to form a more oval shape, shown again here in the heavy black line, with the same Roman stones often used in the reconstruction. Let's jump back now in time to finish our story with the decoding of the building, which is central to the city's history, the Great Mosque of the Umayyads. Much of the scholarship in the early decades of the 20th century, as we have seen, concentrated on the mosque. The Palestine Exploration Fund researchers had already mapped out the broad shape of the concentric compounds, adding further detail to the basic plan sketched 40 years earlier by Porter. This was reflected virtually without change a decade later, when the Italian scholar Caetani adapted the plan to describe the mosque's origins in his multi-volume work, which traced the Arab records of the arrival of Islam. By the time the two dogged German researchers' map of the city was published in 1921, the overall shape of the walled city in ancient times had been established. So had their plan of the two concentric compounds surrounding the Roman temple. However, Wulziger and Watzinger and the French expert Dussault fell into Pocock's trap and continued to regard the remains of the prayer hall of the Umayyad Mosque as part of the late Roman history of the site, i.e. that the mosque directly took over the basilica shape of the Byzantine Church of St. John. There were obvious problems in establishing the building sequence since, as we saw earlier, the 1893 fire had removed virtually all the interior of the mosque prayer hall, except for the central transept. Dussault therefore reconstructed on paper the Church of St. John in this form. The yellow shaded area is the present-day mosque. In fact, such a huge basilica shape would have been unprecedented and a very awkward space for Christian worship, with its altar somewhere in the middle of the structure. It wasn't until 1931 that Pocock's assumption that the Arabs would have been incapable of building something as glorious and beautiful as the mosque prayer hall was finally blown away by the work of the British expert on Islamic architecture, Kenneth Creswell. In his 3-volume study of early Muslim architecture, he reasoned that the assumed church was not feasible and argued that the whole structure within the enclosure was the work of Walid. Creswell provided a sketch reconstructing the way in which the church had once fitted into the Roman temple inner enclosure. a new church structure would have stood on the same spot as the old Roman shrine, not against the south wall, as the mosque did later. Though we have no extant remains at all of the temple or the church, the deduction has been unchallenged since. This plan of the elements of the outer enclosure show the parts which are clearly Roman in origin. None of this Roman structure was used for the mosque prayer hall, which is the area shaded in green, except, as we saw earlier, the lower walls on the southern half. Creswell's findings can thus be incorporated into the plan of the building's history. The green bits on this plan represent the original Arab construction, and the orange area sections that were rebuilt under the successive Islamic rulers from the Umayyads to the Ottomans. The picture of the construction sequence of the inner enclosure after Sauvaget's conclusions were added to Creswell's was now almost complete. The fate of the outer temple enclosure, however, was more of a challenge. We noted earlier that the Great Southern Gateway We noted earlier the Great Southern Gateway, which had formed part of the temple enclosure. The elaborate triple door is today partly obscured. But what lay outside such an important entry point from the open space to the south that had once been part of the outer enclosure? We know from Pocock's plan, here again is my simplification of it, that in his day elements of a colonnade still existed in the space of the south of the mosque, to the south of the mosque, shaded here in yellow. If we add the rather more precise details that Josias Porter identified a century later and which have since disappeared, it becomes obvious that what had occupied that space that had provoked so much speculation over 3 centuries was a courtyard built south of the mosque enclosure, either in the late Byzantine but more probably in the early Islamic period. Arab written sources come to the aid of researchers in reconstructing the history of the area outside the mosque. Beyond the courtyard lay what was probably the palace of the Byzantine governor, which, we are informed by Arab sources, the Umayyad caliphs later converted as their residence, called the Green Dome, or al-Khadra. This area was exposed by a fire in the 1950s and must contain invaluable information, perhaps confirming the Arab use of the area as a sort of ceremonial courtyard lying between the caliph's palace and the mosque. Such arrangements of mosque, courtyard, and governor's residence are today increasingly familiar from research at other Umayyad centres, as can be seen in this restoration of the courtyard and reception hall of the Umayyad Palace in Amman in Jordan. So what did the rediscovery of the ancient and early Islamic city tell European audiences? The picture which has emerged from these centuries of investigation is of a prosperous Roman city, a major cult centre whose fame was spread throughout the Mediterranean world. It lay in an area of rich agricultural resources. It was a city that quickly became a showpiece of the Roman system. Respect for its Semitic past did not stifle the enthusiasm for the Pax Romana and the benefits it brought. A Roman look was added to the basic Semitic form of the temple, and education in Greek, which was of course the language of the Eastern Empire, was enthusiastically adopted. It was, in short, a successful example of the sort of synthesis that Rome sought. The success of Pompey's settlement of 64 BC explains the rapid burst of prosperity that fed the monumental history of the city, the temple and its cross-city colonnaded axes, a streetscape in fact more luxurious than Rome itself enjoyed at the time. There is enough left of classical Damascus to give us a flavour of this stability and prosperity. In the early Islamic period, the city's prosperity continued largely without interruption. The Umayyad Mosque, surely one of the most important single buildings that that has come down to us from the ancient and early Islamic world still serves as the focus of the city's life. While Western scholars were initially reluctant to see the early Islamic centuries as an era of adventurous creativity, it is now clear that the Umayyad Mosque sums up in one building the extraordinary vitality of that era. The courtyard remains one of the great open spaces of world architecture. It was a long struggle before the true picture emerged. Now Europeans play a role in partnership with the Syrian Archaeological Service and a Syrian tradition of scholarship, marked in recent decades by the work of such figures as Khaled Moaz, Abdul al-Haq, Afif Bahnasi, Nasib Salibi, Qasim Touer, and Michel Makdisi. The European Arab tradition of scholarship have now largely converged, and readings of the past, based on prejudiced assumptions, are history. Sadly, away from the scholarly milieu, however, it has become fashionable again in the West in recent years to see Islam as bringing a denial of everything that classical civilization had represented, and which the West likes to see as informing its culture today. In fact, of course, the Umayyad era built upon and brought many fresh interpretations to the 1,000 years of classical culture in the East, going back to Alexander the Great. Like the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, the Umayyad Mosque transformed these ideas in a new synthesis. Thank you.